Hi, welcome to Garden Design 101, from site assessment to installation. I am smiling to myself because this is like the 10th time that I have tried to do the first slide, and I decided from here on out, we're just going or I'm never going to finish. So here you are in this workshop. It's going to be a survey of really broad look at how I go through my process of meeting with a client, coming up with solutions for how they can grow food on their own property, and then some tips and tricks along the way, and just some high point best practices for the design and install. My name is Melissa Wilsford. I am the founder and owner of Rustic Hills Garden Co. And I thought I would give a little background about myself. Prior to starting this business in the fall of 2018, I had been a stay-at-home mom for about 7 years. And prior to that, I worked in, I majored in communications journalism with a Spanish minor, and then I worked in nonprofit work in fundraising, development, and public relations. So really nothing to do with growing food. However, I'm a lifelong gardener. I did it as a kid growing up with my dad. He taught me everything about planting and sowing and harvesting, and just really created a love for me for growing food. And then that only blossomed even more as I became an adult and became a mom. So that time as a stay-at-home mom, I spent learning even more about growing food, about local food, about sustainability issues, about environmental impacts, about social food justice, all sorts of issues that all come back to this issue of growing our own food. So as I started to wonder, what should I do when I grow up again, that is go back to work as my kids start to get older, I decided I really wanted to be a part of this area of food one way or another. And I decided to go forward with my own company, helping others to grow their own food, because I really do love working directly with people and sharing a passion of mine with them and just seeing them become successful and enjoy it as I do. So I like to tell that backstory because I think it just goes to show that you don't necessarily have to have the letters behind your name in order to be successful in really any field that I've found in this one. My own experience, my initiative, my ability to self-teach, and just a drive to just always be learning has been enough. And I have a lot of knowledge to share, and that's what it's all about, just starting with what you know and offering that and just keep moving forward. So let's talk about what we're going to cover today. The three main sections we're going to be delving into are consultations, design, and installation. So something you should know about Rustic Hills Garden Co. is that we specialize in both edible landscaping, so working food into the landscape, and the more dedicated food garden, like a veggie type garden. And those end up looking a lot different. So although the focus of this presentation is going to be on kind of the design and install aspects of the edible garden, when we're talking about the consultations, and as you see some of my examples, you'll see a lot of that edible landscaping side of it as well. Just because when I meet with a client, it's all a possibility. And we'll talk about the options for edible landscaping or a dedicated edible garden. And so there's just a lot of overlap there. So let's get started with the consultation. Oh, P.S. That's my daughter, Charlotte, picking purple potted peas from our garden at home. So I'll be showing you later more about how to build a rustic arch trellis. Okay, the consultation. So in here, we're going to be talking about getting the tour, assessing the site, brainstorming options, and then I'm not going to go into this with any further slides, but of course, before you leave a consultation, you should be collecting bid requests, as in, what do they actually want to give you a bid for? What do they actually want you to give them a bid for? Take photos, measurements, take notes about where utilities are and all that kind of stuff before you leave the premises. Otherwise, you're going to have to come back and do it again later. So give me a tour. That's the first thing I pretty much say when I walk up after I introduce myself. It's just the easiest way to start. Give me a tour. Show me around. What are we working with? What are we talking about? And as we walk through their property, really my goal is to get a sense of what they want. They might not even know exactly what they want, but somewhere in there, they do have a goal or goals in mind. And it's my job to help tease that out and maybe create some vision too, to help them get an idea of how we might reach those goals. So like I said, a lot of times it's like this client I have here, this is actually one of my early clients. You know, I arrived on site and they were just like, ugh, our yard, just please help. It's so ugly. We hate it. We never use it. We want it to be beautiful. Well, what does beautiful mean? How much of this yard are we going to turn into something beautiful? Are you talking about just adding a little bit or converting the whole space? How much food are you up for growing? What other kind of plants do you want to grow? There's just, you know, what other goals do you have in mind? Do you want this to be a social space? Do you need more privacy? Do you need shade? Just so many things. So we spent quite a while kind of teasing that out and asking the right questions to get an idea of what they're looking for. So some other questions you might want to ask, or that you definitely should ask, are there any long-term plans for this space? So sometimes as an afterthought, if I'm not careful to ask, I'll find out that they're actually planning on adding a patio or a deck or an addition to their home. And that really affects, of course, the you know, whether you can place a vegetable garden there, you know, whether it makes any sense to do any landscaping, if it's going to get torn up later because a construction crew is going to come through, and all that kind of stuff. So kind of knowing that if there's anything in the works, that needs to be figured out first and maybe even done first before they move on to this other stuff. Sometimes they're just so excited to get started with growing the plants that they don't realize that you kind of need, that's kind of putting the horse before the cart there. I talked about the broad goals you might want to achieve, some other practical issues. What's the flow of traffic like in your yard, especially if there's kids or pets? Like, where is everybody running through? Where do they always travel? Because they're unlikely to want to change that. So even if you have this idea of creating this beautiful enclosed space around your patio with like full landscaping, and you're supposed to take this little stepping stone path to get out to the yard, if the dog and the kids don't already go on that little spot, chances are they're just going to cut through your new landscaping because they will go where they're going to go. So that's wise, you know, knowing if space needs to be left open for playing or running around. If the dog always does a certain lap or loop around the yard, those are all important things to keep in mind. I like to know, if possible, where their kitchen window is, because if you're growing food, it's always great to see where the food is growing from your kitchen. And we'll talk about this a little bit, but you know, the sun, sun is going to be a big issue. So if they're looking at an edible garden, they only have sun in the front yard. Are they open to growing in the front yard? Sometimes a client starts me in the backyard, and as we talk more and I hear all their goals, I'm realizing they may not be able to accomplish the goals they want to accomplish in their backyard. And so they didn't even plan on me looking in their front yard, but then we had that direction to see if we can come up with some ways to accomplish what they want. And then any concerns or priorities, such as, you know, keeping up with the status quo in the neighborhood might be important to some, especially if you're going to be working in the front yard. Do they have budget constraints in mind? Do they have a goal for productivity? Like, how much food do you really want to create? Or do you just want a little bit to graze throughout the summer, or are you wanting to store this for the winter as well? And kind of along with that, to help get a sense of how big we're talking, is like, how much of this yard do you want to convert into non-yard, whether that's the edible landscaping or the, you know, enclosed garden and stuff like that. So with these clients, I asked that question and found out that they're like, well, we just need like maybe a tiny little patch of grass. Our kids are old enough, they're not playing in the backyard, or if they do, if we're going to play football or something, they go to the park. So really, we want this to just be a lush, full space. And that's really helpful for getting a sense of what you're working with. So as we are walking through that site, getting the tour, asking all sorts of questions, we're also going to want to be taking some notes on other things, assessing the site for especially sun, soil, water, and pests. Of course, there's a lot of other things you should be looking at too, but these are the ones you cannot miss, especially in that first consultation. So sun is obvious, it may be an obvious thing, but where you have more sun, you can grow larger fruited items. I like to tell my clients as a rule of thumb that the larger the thing that they are eating from the plant, the more sun that it needs. So, large tomatoes and melons and squash and things like that need the most sun, eight or more hours. And then down from there, even a cherry tomato versus a large tomato can get away with less sun, all the way down to the leafy greens and herbs where you're just eating the leaves. So even if it's a scrawny plant, you still get a harvest, and you can kind of cheat and do a shady area, even though that same plant would still be happier with more sun. So as I'm walking through and I'm hearing their goals and the kinds of things that they want to grow, I'm looking around for the greatest potential for sunlight. And like I mentioned in the last slide, this may also be where we say, oh, well, have you considered your front yard, or a space that we weren't initially looking at? The soil is, oh, and I wanted to say one more thing. Actually, depending on the time of year that you're doing the consultation, it may be a little tricky to understand where the sun's at. So always just remember that in early spring and late fall, the sun is lower on the horizon, and that's going to change how it's casting shade or sunlight in the yard. And also, if you go out on an overcast day, like I have in this picture here, you can't even really see what's going on. And there were different trees and such where I was kind of curious as to where the sun landed. But sometimes you can tell, and I think you can see a little bit in this picture here, where the grass is greener versus bleached out here, kind of is a clue as to where the sun might be. And this did turn out to be this swath of the brightest part of the yard here, where the grass is pretty bleached out, and then these darker green areas were the shadier spots in the yard. So that's another clue that you can look for when you're trying to figure out sun. Okay, so soil. Here in Minnesota, we mostly have loamy to slightly clayey, neutral soil for the most part, but that doesn't mean that that's what everybody has. For instance, we have a lot of lakes as well. So some people, depending on where they live, their house is basically built right on top of a sandbar. You go down a few inches and it's just like a beach under there, just pure sand. And obviously that's not going to work for a lot of plants that are going to need more moisture retention and nutrition that's offered by sand. So that's going to drastically affect the strategy that you come up with for growing in their property. Also, so the soil, you can probably get a sense of it just by getting a handful of it. And if you're not familiar with kind of how to test the soil by feel, you can look up some YouTube videos just about how it holds together or falls apart. That'll give you a little bit of a sense. If you think you're working with an extreme case, or if there's a possibility on an unknown about whether there might be toxins in the soil, you can always send a soil sample to your local university to get a full workup on the soil and really know what is the composition of the soil and what's in there. For instance, in metropolitan areas, oftentimes there's more of a concern with toxins because of the way the land was handled in the past, or heavily trafficked areas when gasoline used to be leaded and whatnot. So lots of times homeowners actually already know about that. They were either told that by the city or when they bought the house. All things to be aware of. So water, this is really just taking note of any notable circumstances with the property involving water flow. So for instance, sometimes property is like at the bottom of the neighborhood, and kind of the sloping of the neighborhood draws a lot of water. It all comes down through a part of their yard. There might be downspouts where the watershed from the house is all landing in one spot. That might be an opportunity to harvest the rainwater or to add a rain garden. There may be places where there are no gutters and the water pounds, falls off the edge of the roof and pounds right in the soil right there, and it's gonna be hard to grow anything too delicate right underneath that spot, or maybe, gutters need to be considered. And there might be dry areas like underneath mature trees, or just really sunny, exposed, or windy areas. So this is all something to ask questions about and take observations about, so you don't end up putting a plant with like a high need for moisture, or one that prefers a more moist area in a really dry area. For instance, elderberries like kind of a little bit more mucky, wet conditions, and I wouldn't want to put them in that sandbar that we talked about earlier. Finally, the pests, I'm really talking about critters. So The most common culprit that I think people have almost no matter where they live are rabbits, and rabbits are going to get some special attention later in this presentation, but also questioning, do they have deer? That's less of a problem in the city. Usually those city lots have more problems with squirrels. Out in the country more, maybe, more interesting animals like raccoons or possums, but just finding out what we're going to be dealing with so that you can come up with strategies to make sure that the food that they're growing is well protected. So as we're walking through, I'm going to be starting to talk to them about the ideas that I have. Like, what are the possibilities here? What do you think about this? Or what do you think about that? Would you like this? Would you like that? And not only do we do some of that brainstorming on site, but then I take those ideas back to the office and further develop them later. But it's important to start brainstorming in that consultation for me in my process anyway, because that's part of how I get a sense of what we're basically going to be doing so I can give them a design bid. So suggestions for options when we're talking about foodscaping generally fall within 3 categories. One being the veggie garden, it could have fruits in it too, but this is like the either can be like raised beds if deer aren't so much of an issue, or the enclosed garden, enclosed with a fence. And for these, the most important feature, of course, is again the sun, and does the client approve the location, whether it's like the front yard or not, things like that. And if it is in the front yard, you might have to be painting a picture of them or showing some photos of how a kitchen garden can be really beautiful even in the front yard. The second option is edible landscaping. You may not be offering this in your business, but it is certainly something that you can always start to tiptoe into. This is a great way to add more food production and really to meet homeowners halfway, because some people aren't ready to go all in on a big old enclosed vegetable garden, but they already have landscaping, and most people feel that they need to take care of the landscaping already. So why not come up with some solutions for incorporating food into the landscape? And that's really what got my attention about the concept of edible landscaping and got me excited about it. So, I'm looking for opportunities to either incorporate edibles into existing landscaping, or maybe I'll be developing some new landscaping for them, and it could be heavily edibles, or it could be a mixture of flowers and shrubs and grasses and edibles, or even just a few sprinkled in. So, and then finally, and this is a great addition if you're primarily selling the dedicated vegetable garden, see if you can encourage them to add in some fruit or nut trees. Find a place in the property that could use a tree or 2 or 5, and give them that opportunity to have a large harvest from a perennial fruit tree or a nut tree that's just going to keep coming every year, and be so productive and offer habitat and privacy and shade and all these other great things too. So this design here is of the first case study that I started showing you, that blank slate of a backyard. And they did say that they wanted most of their yard to go. They wanted lots of color. They wanted to have some raised beds. And so this is what we came up with. My process is, like I said, I got a sense that from them of how much they wanted to convert into gardens or landscaping. And then based on the square footage and how big of a project we're talking about and the complexity of it, I was able to give them a design bid. But then it was after I went home that I went and I gave them a few different layouts, and we eventually arrived on this one. So here we have, as far as edibles go, we added a serviceberry tree here. These are their 2 existing apple trees. We added this kind of enclosed vegetable garden. They opted for the triangular beds, even though these are not really the most efficient as far as square footage of growing space, but they liked the way that looked. And then incorporate into the landscape, besides that serviceberry and apples, we also have blueberries here, chives, rhubarb up in here, a bunch of alpine strawberries around their patio. So a lot of fun foods mixed in throughout. And what was cool about this one, as I asked them about any sort of pressure from critters, they said they really didn't have to worry about that because, well, they have a tall fence and they're in the city, so there's no deer. And for the rabbit situation, they had a stray cat who years before had just adopted their family. Basically, they started feeding it and it hangs out in their yard. They got it, you know, vaccinated and cleaned up and everything, but it just remained an outdoor cat and basically kills everything that comes into their yard, which makes them kind of sad, but it turned out to be a great scenario for growing food just without any restrictions in their backyard. So here is the after picture after we finish that design and install. Actually, you can see the kitty down here. And this is really fun. So now this is a space that they enjoy, they can socialize in. It's an extension of their home, which felt very full with 4 teenage kids in a smaller house with not a lot of windows. And so she, especially the wife, she just like loves being able to go out there and enjoy her yard as an open space to enjoy. So that was a really fun one. So let's do another case study, kind of thinking about all of the items we touched on as far as that consultation and the brainstorming options and coming up with a solution. So when I arrived at this location, again, the client didn't really know exactly what they wanted. They wanted to grow some food. They had heard about Rustic Hills and liked the idea, but they didn't necessarily have something exact in mind. So some things we noted is that they're on a corner lot. So they have a lot of exposure to the neighborhood. It's a nicer neighborhood. Whatever was going to be added would probably be seen by everybody because there really is no privacy in their backyard being on a corner lot. What else? They had a view out their backyard from their patio, from their deck up here, kind of looks straight into the side of their neighbor's house. There's a big blank wall here, which is not really like the prettiest to look at from their backyard. So I was eyeing this space along the back property line as an option to add a garden with some height with vertical elements to kind of break up that wall. So that was an option. But then as we continued to look, we also decided to consider this space along the sidewalk for maybe a couple of raised bed vegetable garden, because that way it could be like a focal point and a beautiful something for people to look at as they walk by, and also again kind of break up the view from their deck out to the street. So other things to note, they had some landscaping that was put in just by the landscaper that just felt very pointless to them, just a bunch of shrubs dropped in, so they had opportunities within the landscaping to swap some things out. Not a lot of deer to worry about, which is significant because that made it, it let me know that we could do a raised bed vegetable garden without a fence and not have to worry about the deer coming and eating it all. Their dog was kind of crazy though. It dug everywhere and ate everything. So we knew we'd have to be able to keep the dog out. And that was kind of it. So the options we came up with, as I said, were swapping out some shrubs in the landscaping up here, and adding a garden, you know, exact layout to be determined either on this back property line or along the sidewalk here. In both scenarios here, they felt it would work out as far as their kids' use of the lawn because they like to have space to play and run, but both of those options seemed out of the way. What ended up being the deciding factor was that on the back side here, there was more of a slope. And although it's not much of a slope, it becomes significant when you're doing raised beds with the purpose of the raised bed keeping the rabbits out, because you need a good 2 feet. I never stop at 2 feet. I always like to go up to like 29 inches to make sure that the rabbits don't get into those raised beds. And if you're going to have the raised beds flat and you're going to level the ground before you put them in, you kind of have to, you have to dig, one side you have to dig into the ground a bit, and then that side is going to be shorter than the other side. And if you're going to build up the other side, then it's just obscenely high. If you're talking about a bigger garden with like a couple of beds, which is what we were thinking about doing. So even that slight slope, which didn't appear to be an issue at first, was kind of a deal breaker for putting on the back end. And then they really started to warm up to this idea of making the garden more of a focal point and something to share with their neighbors who were often walking by on the sidewalk. So The solution was we went with the garden along the sidewalk. We did a pair of rather large weathered steel beds. We just did a wood chip base around and some flagstone stepping stones through the center. And you can see from these two photos kind of a view from the street side. This is a bigger photo. It does a good job, like I said, breaking up that view into their backyard. Not that people can't see, and they didn't necessarily want to just fence people out, but at least when people are walking by, they're looking at the garden instead of staring up at you sitting on the deck or working in the yard. And so that's kind of nice. And then also from the yard side looking out, they liked it because it felt very welcoming, like come and, come in and visit us or see us. And it's kind of like this gateway to their backyard. So, and then like I said in that previous slide, we did end up swapping in some blueberries and alpine strawberries for some of the shrubs in their landscaping. And in order to keep the rabbits off of those, there's a product I really like called Plant Saver. You can get it online. It's a powder and it comes with some muslin bags, and you put a spoonful of the powder in the bag, and I tie one on each blueberry bush to keep the rabbits away. It almost always works. Of course, every neighborhood's cohort of rabbits is different. You never know how they're going to behave. And it's also very important that that the dog can't get to this, or that if there's any pets that are going to be able to get to the bags, that they're protected from that, because the mixture has some blood meal and bone meal in it, which is attractive to the animals, of course. And then if they eat it, that sac can get lodged in their intestines. So this client just altered their invisible fence to be around the landscaping so that the dog would stay out, the rabbits would stay out, and everybody's happy. All right, and then here is them several months later. So I came and visited them at the end of the summer. The tomatoes are already in decline. We'd actually already had some cool weather at this point. And they had been on their own all summer and had not taken my tips on pruning the cherry tomatoes, which is fine, but kind of hilarious. As you can see, those two, each side of the trellis there, that's just one cherry tomato plant on each side. So this garden went gangbusters. It did great. They're so happy with it. They have more than they can use. They're sharing with neighbors. They get tons of comments. Everybody loves it. So it's really cool to see them having a great first experience with growing food. So moving on to our next section. Here we're going to be talking about design, specifically design and best practices for the layout of an enclosed garden. And that previous picture, this is a common setup, is just doing a couple of raised beds without the fence. And I'm not going to be talking about design for that so much. The only thing that I will point out is, like I said, again, if you're going to be using the raised beds to keep rabbits out, 29 inches, that's my magic number. I know lots of people do less, but I like to always make sure that for sure we're keeping them out. And then of course, if deer are an issue, then the raised beds aren't going to help with that. So coming into design here, this is a design that I did for a client, which was a full backyard edible landscape. So here's an example of how I provide the edible landscape design and the vegetable design, sometimes both for a client. Oftentimes they're up for both. Like they wanted to convert their backyard from a blank slate into this awesome productive landscape. And they also wanted that enclosed protected vegetable garden so they could grow the annual vegetables and all the things that are more vulnerable to all the chewing animals. So in this section, we're going to be talking about some basics here. So the nuts and bolts, which are basically best practices for the layout of the enclosed garden. We're going to be talking about maximizing growing space, the concept of leaving open space. We'll touch on that just briefly, and then a couple of creative touches. So nuts and bolts. This is really just about numbers. So I'll kind of go through this. This might be something good to refer back to, just because I feel like if you can use these numbers as you just lay out a garden on graph paper, you're going to be pretty good to go. So row width, I would say at the very least 18 inches, and 3 feet is plenty wide. So 18 inches, your client should know that in the height of summer, when all the plants are growing and going crazy, they're going to be like squeezing through, tiptoeing, like just managing to get through there. But sometimes they're okay with that because they're just trying to maximize every inch of growing space they possibly can. And they're like, I'll deal with that when I come to it. 3 feet, you can fill the beds, they can overflow, you can still pass through. Space between 2 beds with an arched trellis. So for those, I would say you do need to do a minimum of 3 feet in order to be able to harvest under that arch and pass through that arch comfortably. The vines that grow up those arches tend to get very full, and they don't just grow on the outside, they kind of come on the inside and outside and all around. So 3 feet, 5 feet gives like a lot of space to where you're really creating more of a space to enjoy under there as well, like maybe a little table for the kids or a chair for you, or just kind of like more of a statement, like a full area of the garden. And our arch actually has 6 feet under it, and that's how we have a table and chairs under there. Width of a bed that can be reached from both sides, 4 feet wide. So you can comfortably harvest and work in the bed. If it's 4 feet wide, any wider than that, it's going to be a little hard to get to. If you do go ahead and do wider than that, just strategically put plants in the center that don't need to be harvested daily, but maybe are kind of all at once plant to harvest. If you can only reach the bed from one side, we do 2 to 3 feet because you are not really going to be able to reach all the way in beyond that otherwise. Length of any bed, 12 feet long. I just kind of chose that as probably the maximum number for what would annoy me. Really, like it's the having to walk around the bed to get from one place to another. That might be a problem, but otherwise there's no real reason except for later when it comes to building, if you're using wood. Lumber comes in 8 foot, 10 feet, and 12 foot sections, and the 8 foot tends to be the more economical, so a lot of people stick with the 8 foot lengths. Compost bins, big fan of those. Sometimes people don't realize how much they will love them if they have them, so I encourage people to incorporate at least one, preferably 2, and my preference is inside the garden but near the door. And then location of vertical elements, definitely always looking for how we can incorporate vertical elements, but at the same time be thinking about where they're going so they're not casting shade behind them. So on the north side of the garden or somewhere else where they won't do that. And then if you've ever heard the suggestion for beds to be oriented north-south, true, that is the ideal. However, if you need to go east-west because of the design and just like the limitations in the design, that's fine too. Just when you come to the planting plan, don't put the tomatoes on the south side and the green bush beans on the north side. Like flip them around so that the taller things are in the back and the shorter things are in the front, and you shouldn't have a problem. Okay, next sub point here in design is maximizing growing space. So this is of most concern when you're working with a small space. So here are just 3 simple tips for that. On the right here, you can see an example of several layouts that I initially gave to a client for their garden. This one I think is 14 by 13. You're going to see a video on it later. But just talking about how when you're just trying to fill that little box of space, basically you'll always get more square footage if you use the perimeter for beds all the way around. Utilize that perimeter space first. Go ahead and make the beds as deep as you can. And then if there's any space in the middle, add in an extra bed in the center, and always plan for vertical elements. So we have the obelisks, how do you say that word? I always get it screwed up. You guys can laugh at me there. I don't care. And then I think it's obelisk. And then the flat trellises are an option. I have all the vertical elements in orange here. So flat trellis on the back wall, the obelisk, the arch trellises, things like that as a way to maximize your growing space. So this is a case study of those layouts that I just showed you. So again, in my design process, those layouts are what I send the client after I've come home and I'm further developing, brainstorming the options. But before we even get to that point, of course, we have the consultation. And here's what we noted in this site visit. So we came to this backyard. They said they have tons of deer. They wanted to grow food, but their main concern was actually they wanted to kind of renovate these flower beds, these terraced beds that they had on their property, and they're kind of asking if I could help them with that because, as I said, I do other non-edible landscaping as kind of a part of what I do as well. They felt very overwhelmed by the whole the beds there, not sure what to do with them. They just felt like they're big, deep spaces that they couldn't keep up with. Again, the deer and the dog is both an issue for an edible garden. Their kids use most of the yard space to play, and there's not a whole lot of sunny areas. But as we talked more and I was looking at these tiered garden spaces and we're looking at the sun's orientation, again, this is like early spring, you can see there's still snow on the ground. But we determined we thought that they probably got 6 to 8 hours of sun, and that the upper tier would get about 4 to 6 hours of sun. So you probably already guessed what we thought of doing because you saw the layouts on the previous slide, but we decided to take that lower tier of the garden and turn that into their edible garden. So, and then the upper tier is it's not planted yet, but it will be a combination of edibles that don't really require a fence, such as currants and gooseberries, and then some native flowers and things as they get closer to the shaded area of that bed, just things that don't need as much sun. So the ways that this garden solves their problems. They have an enclosed garden. The fence is tall enough to keep the deer and the dog out, the deer and the dog out. We did some careful planning to make efficient use of the square footage that we had. Like I said, that area was just overgrown with weeds. So later we're going to talk about deciding how to handle that and how you can do that with a build on top method. So that's definitely what we did here. And then even within this garden, we did some strategic planting to make sure that on the shadier half of this garden, we put the smaller fruited items that didn't need as much sun. And on the back of the garden where it gets the most sun, we put the larger fruited items. So you're going to get to see a little tour of this garden here. Here's the final plan. You can see that we utilized the perimeter, and you can see the planting plan that we came up with. And I will share this video with you.
So here we are at a client's garden that we designed for a pretty small space. So they already had these terrace garden beds established on their slope down into this pond. And the space we're working with was just 14 feet deep and 13 feet wide. So we worked with them to come up with a layout that would maximize their growing space, gave them a few different options, and this is what they decided on. So first of all, they built this beautiful gate and a stairway going down from the upper terrace down into this one that we were working with. And what you always want to do when you're working with a small space like this is plan your garden beds mostly on the perimeter. Fill out the perimeter first, and then if you have room in the center for another bed, definitely fill that in too. But by doing this, we were able to get almost 100 square feet of growing space. They opted to have a couple arches on either side here, and they left it open underneath. Had they decided to just continue the beds the whole way, they would gain about another 20 feet of growing space. And a substitute option for growing vertically would be to use this back panel, as this is the north side of the garden, so growing vertically here wouldn't shade anything that's trying to grow in the garden. But the arches are certainly a really fun touch. Another thing.
All right, and just cutting myself off there because I made this video for Instagram initially and I go on to talk about other things. So moving on.
So
talking about some of those vertical elements, I just wanted to show a few examples. So the obelisk, the flat panel trellis, and the arch trellis, those are all great options. In this picture here, and you're gonna see a tour of this garden in just a bit, this is the first year that they grew. The tour is their second year when they planted themselves, but I think this is a great example. So this is one arch, and then behind it, there's actually another one in the next set of beds, and that's planted with cucumbers. And you can see that any narrower than the 4-foot wide path that they have would have been difficult to pass through and harvest. So this is why we like to leave a lot of space for those arch trellises. And speaking of arch trellis, we're gonna have a little side excursion into how to do this rustic arch trellis. So this is something I just started playing with and have had a lot of fun with. And as it turns out, my clients are like totally into it and are willing to pay me to have fun and twist sticks together. So I love it because it uses the resources that are available on the client's property. In this case, the client had a ton of red stem dogwood, but in other cases I've pulled out buckthorn saplings and sometimes just tree trimmings that are being, you know, pruned anyway, or sometimes a tree is coming down and we just use that. So it's a really fun way to make, still as a pretty, even with paying me to do the labor, it's a pretty economical approach. And these last like a good 2 years, maybe 3. At the 3rd year, they probably need some reinforcement, but it's also this really kind of pretty sculpture, a natural sculpture. So here's what you're gonna need if you want to build one of these, and you totally can, it's not that hard. You're gonna need like the flexible branches, so young wood, new growth, or saplings. The trick is finding pieces that are 8 feet or longer, ideally, especially if you need a good supply of those for your foundation. You can use some shorter ones to kind of, you know, add on as you go, and you're adding the lateral branches more, but you're gonna need 8 feet so that you can go up and over and twist together and still be able to pass underneath. You need some 2-inch PVC pipe, preferably black, cut into 8-inch lengths, and 2-foot rebar. So step 1 is I place the rebar and the PVC in the ground. I like to do it right inside the raised beds if we're working with raised beds. The first set of these that I didn't do that, so I kind of realized this was a better idea later on. So I just dig down, get the PVC pipe down there flush with the bed. Actually, put in the rebar first where you're going to be putting the PVC, and then put the PVC over the top. The rebar is just extra reinforcement for keeping the PVC in place because it's going to be under some pressure from the branches that you're going to be jamming in there later. So pound in the rebar, add the PVC, and install these pairs of PVC and rebar every 20 inches or so. So this is a 4-foot wide bed. I do 3 and it seems to work well. 4 would probably be, it would be a fuller arch, but 3 is enough. So somewhere in there, you can play with the measurements. The next step, once you get those foundation pieces in, is to start with your longest branches that you have. And I put typically 2 in each slot to get started. And so I just fill them all up. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, have a bunch of those sticking up. And if one branch is exceptionally thick or has a ton of lateral branches, then we can just do 1. Like you can see, this one just has 1, but it's like a V-shaped one that's going to have a lot more to work with. Next step, going back to an older arch because I just didn't have pictures of the first one. The next step is to start joining those main pieces across the way with one another. So all you do is you meet them at the height that you want them at, and you just twist them around one another, and they stay. I don't use anything to secure them besides just wrapping them. You could use twine or something if you wanted to, but I find that that's not necessary. So repeat that with all the remaining pieces. And then you go through, and all those lateral branches that are sticking out the side, you bring those to the side and wrap them around the neighboring foundation pieces. And you can go in and add more pieces. If you have shorter branches, you twist them onto one and then across and twist them onto the other. Here's a close-up of how well that red-stemmed dogwood works. It's so flexible, and it's really pretty too. So you just keep going and going and adding until it's the way you like. Each project just turns out different. They're all unique. Here's the one on the left is the buckthorn arch. The one on the right is a red stem dogwood. And you can also use this method to grow or to create enclosures for growing more vulnerable edibles like in the landscape. So in times where we've been trying to come up with some creative solutions for growing the food, protecting the food, but also not having it look bad, this is what we've done. So this is obviously a front walk of a client's house. She really only had sun right on this front walk, and she wanted to grow some greens and everything else in their yard is just shady. So on the back here, we have some alpine strawberries. This is a fall planting. So she did, mustards and lettuces and things like that. And we used all these branches from a tree that they were taking down anyway. And all we did was put bird netting over the top. So that black bird netting, you can't even hardly see that it's there. You certainly can't see it from the street. And this is done well in keeping the rabbits and deer out, both of which they had a lot of. Of course, again, I always like to give the disclaimer that every neighborhood, pack of deer and rabbits are different, and squirrels, some might dig in there or tear that apart. But for a lot of people, it work. If you continue to have problems, you just have to keep testing with trial and error and to see what you can come up with for a solution. All right, so as much as we all want to grow a ton of food, of course, in the garden, it's not all about that. We want to leave some open space to maybe just enjoy the garden as an extension of our home, a place to be, or dedicate some space to creative touches. So this is, if I can work this into a garden, if we have a space to work with, we definitely do it. This is our garden. And this is the arch that I mentioned that has 6 feet between the 2 beds. And then we're able to have those little toadstool table and chairs under there, which the kids love sitting at and eating whatever they pick from the garden. It's a cute little center point or focal point of our garden. Another good use of open space is just so that you have room to maneuver. So this 6-foot wide garden path continues through our garden from the door back to this arch. Oops. And that's just useful for bringing in mulch and things like that, or making a large harvest or garden cleanup. Here's a couple more examples of just creative elements included in gardens. On the left is at Magnolia in Texas. They have this fun rustic fort that I really liked with all the, again, toadstool stools in there and plants growing up the structure. On the right is one of my favorite places in Decorah, Iowa, Seed Savers Exchange. This is Diane's exhibition garden, and I just love their bright orange bird bath there, which is a beautiful accent and also obviously practical for caring for the birds and attracting them to your garden. And again here, so keeping in mind the open space and some of the other things we talked about, the planning for vertical elements, some creative touches, what we talked about with the nuts and bolts, with the width of the beds and the width of the aisles. Here are a couple examples that I sent to a client as a first round of brainstorming ideas. So again, I knew that we're working with a certain garden space, and then I send them different layouts for them to consider, and we kind of mix and match until we find a layout that they really like. So in these examples, the purple are in-ground beds, the blue are raised beds, the green circles are perennial fruits. They wanted a lot of blueberries and like some gooseberries as well. And the orange are the vertical elements. So I actually really loved this one because it had a pergola in the center that was for a sitting area, and I thought they could grow grapes up and over it, and it's just this awesome focal point. I also like the symmetry in this garden because it would be flanked by these 2 arched trellises in the back. But in the end, they arrived at something really, there's a few adjustments off of this, but they arrived at something really close to this with tons of the raised beds, because they wanted to just maximize their production. They're going to put a fruit tree in the corner back here with a little sitting area under that. So that will be kind of a fun destination in the far back corner of the garden. And I do like how this one leaves a little more open space at the entrance. So we're talking about making sure you leave some open space. They have a nice 2, 4, 6, 8, a good 8 to 10 feet wide here, because they have a pretty big garden. So that's a big kind of highway to access a large portion of the garden and go off to the sides here, which will be really handy for them as they're working. And they had this space to play with for that. So that's why that worked out for them. All right, so another case study that touches on a lot of these points that we've been talking about. This is actually the yard from the design that you saw in the opening slide. I had the watercolor edition of the full backyard edible landscape with the garden. So when I first arrived at these people's house, I could see obviously right away they had a ton of space to work with. They told me that they would like to convert most of that yard into gardens. They had 2 little girls. They just wanted to create a space where they could run and explore and experience nature and food, and have just more things that inspired them to kind of dig around in the dirt and weave in and out. They're very interested in natural features, like natural playscapes. They have very natural aesthetic. And then there's quite a bit of sun back here, but they kind of in this back corner here have some woodsy wasted space. You can see this is another picture of behind this. It's just kind of, what are you going to use that for? So I went home from that consultation with a sense of kind of percentage wise, how much of this yard that we're talking about converting into landscape and how big of a garden they wanted. We were able in the meeting to kind of say, oh, the garden should probably go here just based off the sun. And then from there, went home, sent them the 3 or so layouts of how it could look, it could flow this way or that way, you could orient it this way or that way. And then came up with our final plan, which you saw that watercolor rendition of. Here is a picture of the garden, and that's what we're going to focus on since we're talking about garden design. Oops. So yeah, this is our solution. A large enclosed garden. They had some of that open flex space at the doorway that we've talked about, where the open space is helpful for just practical reasons. I'm going to show you a video here that walks you through here. It's going to get cut off again, but at the end of it, you kind of see the beginning of how back behind the garden, they added some natural features for playing and exploring pathways. And then kind of a fun thing that they decided on was a pea gravel foundation for the garden, which really just doubled as a giant sensory bin for their little kids because they love to sit in there and scoop the pebbles. Yes, and as you know, the garden sits within a larger edible landscape. Here's some pictures from inside the garden. Again, here's the photo you saw earlier of the double arches. This is a view of the entrance from out here. And again, there's the whole plan. And then I'm just gonna give you a little live video. I am sorry that this video's quality is so bad. I tried to fix it so many times. So just forgive me, I'm sorry. But I'll let you have a little tour here.
They're working on getting some grapes established here. So once those get going, this is just their first year. So once they get going, they'll be up and over the top of this arch, will look just awesome. And inside here, we planned this garden, since they have a large backyard, we planned it with plenty of space for maneuvering, which is really nice. When you come in this way, there's lots of room for like bringing in the wheelbarrows or, even just for the kids to play, things like that, for putting a pile of the things that you've harvested. If you come in this way, you can see that right along the side to the entrance here is the compost bins. They have a covered one and then 2 open ones. It's kind of a nice variety. They have lots of room so that they can, fill up one while the other one is composting, and it's really handy to have it right inside the door so that you can access it easy from the kitchen, but also inside your garden so you can pull out and easily use it in your beds rather than hauling it from a different part of the yard. Continuing with that, like I said, they have space. So we have a nice wide center pathway. It's just nice for, plenty of room when these plants get large and spill over. This bed is empty only because they've cleared it out and they have replanted for fall, so those will be filling in. But the main reason we did the 4-foot wide pathway down the center here is that they have 2 sets of arched trellises, and up those last year we did cucumbers and tomatoes. This year they planted on their own again cucumbers. A different variety on this side that is like a more dwarf variety, I think, as it turns out. But last year we had the same on both sides, and it was so full that you could pass through, but had it been any narrower than 4 feet, it would have been probably impossible. So, and if you come down here a little further, these are cherry tomatoes being trained up the same type of arched trellis, and as you can see, 4 feet is just enough to be able to still get in there and harvest and pass through easily. So the beds themselves, 4 feet deep, because we can access them from both sides, which means that we can go ahead and make them 4 feet wide rather. If you come over here on the side, if you can see these beds against the perimeter of the garden, we made only 2 feet deep so that it'd be easy to harvest from just the inside of the garden. Along the edge here too, we have some more perennial fruits. These are all honeyberries. Come around this way. A couple more beds getting planted for fall here. This is asparagus. This is what asparagus looks like after it has leafed out. So you pick asparagus until like June, and then you let it do this because it's storing up energy for next year. It needs to photosynthesize all the energy, store it in the roots, and then the asparagus will pop up first thing in the spring. Come follow me back through here. Just wanted to show you on this end that we have some more perennial fruits. These are all blueberries. These are only in their second year, and they maybe take a little while to get going, but once these are full grown, they will be filling up this space, a good 3 to 4 feet tall and wide. And then I just have to show you this awesome area. So they have a gate coming out the back side here. We planned this space to be just like a native flower garden with a lot of flowers that do okay in the part shade, because as you can probably see, we're under a tree here. So as the garden moved this way, there's a little more shade cover. So back here we have things like Asclepias, which is the butterfly weed. I think they've mixed it up a little bit, but Monarda, coneflower, echinacea, those are all things that can do kind of some part sun. And then back in here, we just have like a natural kind of playscape. They brought in some logs from a tree that they cut down. And back in here we have a lot of
all right.
they're
Great. So I hope you enjoyed a couple of those tours. A little bit of repetition on my part, sorry about that, but it's nice to get a visual of the gardens that we've been working in. And our third and final section in our survey here is going to be on installation. Now, I'm not going to be able to have the time to tell you how to exactly do everything, but I wanted to touch on some high points here, some important points, I should say. So the 3 areas we're going to talk about are in-ground versus building on top. You're probably aware by now that building on top or doing raised beds is by far the more popular choice these days, but even with garden designs that are largely raised beds, there's often an in-ground portion, or sometimes you might consider doing a fully in-ground bed, or of course, if you're doing landscape when we're talking about working in ground. Materials, just some basic thoughts on those. And finally, like I promised, talking about rabbits because they are the worst. So these are our last 3 points as we finish up this presentation. So let's get going. Okay, building the garden, in ground or on top? That's the question. So there are pros and cons to each method. In ground. So of course, we're just, for this option, we're just clearing out the existing growth and planting in the native soil. The pros are it's low cost, it uses fewer resources to create, requires less watering, and is less work to implement at first. The cons are you're going to have more of an ongoing fight with weeds. For that reason, it's often harder to maintain. The native soil may be poor or not good at all to grow in. And for all these reasons, it oftentimes becomes more work in the long run. Building on top. So this is where you can, maybe you don't have anything to smother, but it is a great option for if you do need to smother existing growth like weeds or even those seeds that are all just waiting to germinate right below the surface. And then you go ahead and build raised beds and bring in new clean soil. So the pros. Weed seeds are buried, remain dormant. It's easy to keep track of where the pathways and the beds are, which is hard enough for me to do back before I had raised beds, but certainly having young children, this is a selling point for parents who are wanting their kids to be able to know, like, where is okay to walk and where did we just plant, a bunch of seedlings. It's a good solution when it comes to unusable or poor native soil, has a clean, organized look that many people like, and really because you're able to focus all your efforts on just the growing space, it's less effort in the long run. It is higher cost to implement, especially these days with materials costs being so high. It uses more resources to build, often can require more watering. I don't find this to be a huge issue, but the deeper the bed, the drainage is better. It doesn't have the protection of being down in the soil and conserving as much moisture. So you may have a need to water more, and it's a little more work to implement at first. Okay, so let's talk about building in ground. So some of the examples here are more to do back to the edible landscaping, but of course it applies to a garden as well. And let's talk about scenario one. Scenario one is the site is relatively free of weeds or noxious weeds. Maybe there was grass there that was like not in bad shape, or plants that aren't dropping like thousands and thousands of little weed seeds everywhere. So course of action. First, you kill the sod and or the plants by, you can remove it. This is one way to do it. In this case, we took a sod kicker to it, removed all that sod. The catch with that is you need a place to put it. You can have it hauled away, which is a pain and kind of a waste. Or if you can incorporate it into the landscape somehow, that is a great option, which is what we did here. You can see the two piles. We made two berms out of all that sod that we removed. We bring in a load of black dirt, dump them over the top of the sod to smother it and allow it to just break down and decompose. And then let that be a part of the landscape that added a little more interest. So you can see the paths kind of winding through those two berms and around and making this more interesting than just flat landscape. So that's one way to deal with the sod. Another option for dealing with the sod is you can smother it to kill it off and then later come back and till it in. That's how we started our first garden. This is like 15 years ago, our first garden. Killed off the grass in that way the fall before, and then a nice neighbor came over with his tractor and tilled it all up for us the following spring. That worked great. It's just, interestingly enough, though, I did eventually switch over to the raised beds because the weeds just kept on coming that were dormant in the soil, and the crabgrass was sneaking in from the perimeter of the garden and all that kind of stuff. And finally, an option, kind of labor intensive, I have to admit, but you can turn over the soil. This is a great option, or turn over the sod or the plant matter. This is a great option, again, if there's not a lot of weed seeds. And if you don't have like a great place to put all that sod. If we had removed all the sod in this city lot, this is the example that you saw at the beginning of the presentation, we didn't really feel like we had like an open space to put it, and bringing in a load of black dirt was not super attractive. We already brought in some compost and such, and mulch, of course, to amend the soil and to cover the soil. And adding another few yards of dirt on top of that did not seem fun because it all had to be brought in by wheelbarrow from the alley here. So that would have been more labor intensive and more expensive, and it just didn't really fit. So in this case, we actually went through with a shovel because again, we didn't have the time. We were trying to get this done, so we didn't have the time to smother the sod and then wait until. So we turned it all over, and about a week later, after it had a chance to dry out a little bit, we came back and tilled it in. So that worked great. You can see this is all sod getting turned over with a shovel. It's a great workout. And then came back and tilled. For the most part, that worked really well. There were some places where grass popped up. So if you're going to choose that method with a client, you just need to tell them, like, you know, just be aware you're going to have to do some hand pulling that first season just for anything that maybe was able to reroot and establish itself. So after any of these methods, till and plant and move on with your life. But what about scenario 2, where the area has a lot of weeds and probably weed seeds, or maybe plants that just keep spreading and growing, like these daylilies here. One option for getting this under control is repetitive tilling. Now, repetitive tilling is a little, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, it's a little debatable about whether it's always the greatest answer, but it sometimes can work out well. This is the option that we decided to go with for this client because this is a large edible landscape that you saw earlier with the enclosed garden that we did a tour of. They mostly had like weeds in here, but nothing so bad that, you know, the root segments were going to be multiplied and then, you know, coming up as new weed babies. So, and we had some time because we were talking in the fall and we weren't going to start until the following spring. So they decided that they would take that route. They decided to till in the fall. Then they covered that whole area with their leaves as they fell, which was great for adding nutrients to the soil. And then in the spring, as all the little weed babies started germinating again, they tilled, and then they tilled one more time before they planted their landscape. Again, it was with the caveat that they understood there would most likely be some weed seeds that still germinated later on, especially since different weeds germinate at different times of year, and that they would have to go back and hand pull those. But it ended up being a good solution for them to get going on the timetable that they wanted to get going on. So there's where it was, and then here's their landscape as it is now. So it's really important, though, as I just touched on briefly, that we're not doing a repetitive tilling method in a landscape that has noxious weeds, especially those like thistle, whose root segments will each turn into basically a new plant, because then all you're doing is multiplying the problem. So to give you an idea, the recommended tilling strategy for Canadian thistle is to till every 4 to 6 weeks for 2 to 3 years. That's how long it would take to get on top of that kind of weed. So not only is that a lot of work, it's also really damaging to the soil. So be aware of what you're working with before you try the tilling, the repetitive tilling method. So another option, if you've got a lot of weeds you're dealing with, this is my house. Oh, the red house isn't mine, that's my neighbor's house. So actually I wanted to expand our native garden over onto his property with his permission up to his driveway. And on his side, he's just got a lot of creeping Charlie, like tons of creeping Charlie and crabgrass. And what I decided to do was to try black plastic method. I had used it a couple other times with other people and it had worked well. And I decided to try it out here in the case of creeping Charlie. It doesn't take long to kill the vegetative growth on the surface when you're using a plastic method, but it will take much longer to wait out all the weed seeds that need to come, to their time, sprout, and then die. So if you're going to use a plastic smothering method, you can do clear plastic as well. I just have had better success with black. But if you're gonna do that, you'll need to give it 10 or maybe 11 months if you really don't wanna have a reemergence of a problem. Even then, be aware that if you go back and till that area, and this is a very weedy area, if you go back and till that area, you have just woken up all those, those dormant weed seeds that are just a few inches below the soil that wouldn't have been killed off by the smothering method. So in this landscape, I smothered all the creeping Charlie that was there. And then I planted right in it without tilling and then kept up with it that following season, and it did great. So here's a little video about how I do things at my house, which is a lot messier. So that explains why I just have debris laying all over the place. But here you can see the grand reveal on how this method worked for us.
Hey, so a lot of people ask me how you can kill off your grass easily. And many people have heard about laying down plastic. I've heard the idea of laying clear plastic and it, solarizes the grass. And sometimes I have seen that backfires. So what I have found, I think that works the best, is dark plastic. So here I have some heavy duty black plastic that I laid down last fall. And now we are here in May. So it's had a good amount of time, but I haven't actually truly pulled it back yet. So this is grass and a ton of creeping Charlie. So if this can kill that mess, then I think it's a good solution. So let's see how we did. As you can see, I just held down the plastic with random junk that I had. I had some landscaping staples too, but those actually got pulled out with the wind. So, dying hostas, boards, whatever. Okay, let's see. It was grass and creeping Charlie before.
Oh, wow.
Does that look good? It's like black dirt under there. I don't know, it looks pretty dead. So that's my recommendation. Try black plastic, put it on just, anytime really. Mow the grass really short, put the plastic down, give it a few months. I like doing it in the fall because I'm not doing anything with the lawn at that point anyway, and it's dead in the spring. Good luck.
All right, so building on top. So as opposed to trying to make use of the native soil that you have, here's another option. And this can be a great solution Besides even the fact that people just like to use raised beds, or it might be a good solution for dealing with rabbits. I mean, what if you have a garden like this? So this is a client who bought a new house, and happily it had this garden space already dedicated with a pretty rabbit-proof fence. It has an extra layer of chicken wire in there to keep the rabbits out, but it had been neglected for years. And because you can't really mow in there, it had just turned into a weed garden, which means generations upon generations of weed seeds just dropping to the ground. I always give my clients this advice, like even if you can't go through and truly like get the roots out and weed everything, just whatever you do, don't let the weeds go to seed. Even if it just means going through it and ripping the tops off or cutting them off with the scissors, or even just mowing it down before the seeds become mature, like just don't let them go to seed, because then this happens. So this garden was a great candidate for building on top. Let's talk about how to do that. How to build on top. So I'm showing you here how we do it when the garden foundation is going to be wood chips. I really like doing a wood chip foundation for a garden because it offers flexibility with planting. You know how I said I like to add that, that kind of wiggle room, that extra open space? Another reason I like to do it is because sometimes I play with the aisles. You know, maybe I let a vine take over some of the space, or I let some volunteer flowers pop up there, or maybe you decide you want to add some ground cover like creeping thyme, or let strawberries go in your pathway, things like that. So when you have a mulch foundation, you can do all that. If you do stone of some kind, you can't grow in it, but it is, I have to admit, less work over time because the stone doesn't break down, doesn't need to be replenished, and you don't have to weed it usually. But because of the upfront costs and both materials and labor involved in stone, lots of times we do have clients who decide to go with the wood chip base. So if that's what we're doing, here's how we go about it. On the perimeter of the garden, you can see is the plastic edging or whatever edging they decide to use. And then right on the other side of that is this transition zone. And in this transition zone, we do go ahead and dig out, whether that's sod kicking or shoveling out the existing growth, because when we're bringing in several inches of wood chips, how are you going to add, say, 5 inches of wood chips on top of the garden and not have that overflowing out of the edging into the lawn? So we need it to be able to taper down and meet the same height as the edging is at. So that's why we do this transition zone. We actually pull out some of the bulk so that we can, to make that transition to the garden when you're building a top is actually making the garden higher. So the garden is higher here and it kind of tapers down to meet the edge. So edging, whatever kind you want to use, then transition zone. Then within the garden, you can just smother the rest of it. So cardboard is the next layer. If you don't have cardboard, you can do paper shopping bags or like 5 to 10 sheets of newspaper. This is just something that will last long enough to smother the grass and kill it, but then eventually break down. On top of that layer, we do a good thick layer of mulch, like 4 to 5 inches. On top of that, you can put your raised beds and fill them with soil. So just a little disclaimer here, in the pictures you're going to see for this garden, we put the beds right on the grass, but you can also fill the whole garden with wood chips and then put the bed on top of the wood chips. I've done it both ways, both work, even though it seems counterintuitive that you could add just like an 8-inch bed on top of 5 inches of wood chips and like things would actually grow. They do. I tried it on myself first and on friends first before I tried on any clients, and it just always worked out great. No problems. Even in the first season, I think those wood chips just break down pretty quickly and the roots find their way even through the wood chips and into the soil below, and it's not a problem. The only thing is I wouldn't use, say, cedar chips because those are not going to break down very fast at all, and they would cause problems for the roots of those plants trying to navigate those wood chips that never break down. So next slide. So here we have more pictures of that same close-up you just saw on that last slide. So here in this picture, you can see us removing the perimeter for that transition zone we talked about. And then down here, we added all that cardboard. And we didn't add the cardboard in this case under the beds. And actually the reason why we did that differently in this one is because if you remember seeing this arch trellis from earlier pictures, that was that red stem dogwood arch. We actually installed this double bed with the arch early in the spring because budget-wise, that's what they were ready to put in. And for that, we just removed all the sod. So that's actually sitting lower. And then at the end of the summer, we were finishing off this garden. So I didn't want these two beds to be any higher than they needed to be as compared to the two beds back there. And that's why I didn't do full smother with wood chips and then just bring the beds in on top of the wood chips. I wanted to kind of even things out. So that's just a little explanation for why we did it this way in this case. Like I said, either way works. And then here's a finished product. So the beds go in, the soil goes in, and the fence went up, and it's just like a beautiful garden. It's really awesome now. So they have a pretty simple layout, just like a quad of raised beds here with the arch. And then along the side here are blueberry bushes, which will get bigger. They'll be 3 to 4 feet wide and tall, room for asparagus, and their compost bins are going to be added later as well. So that was a fun one. All right, moving on to materials. So we're getting close to the end here. Installing gardens, there's all kinds of materials you're going to use. This is by no means a comprehensive list, but I was just thinking, what do we use a lot of? Because there's a couple things I have to say about these. These are more like just tips or maybe a soapbox or two. So lumber, soil, and wood chips. We use a lot of these. Every garden, almost every garden uses them. So lumber, if this is something, it's pretty common knowledge among us gardeners, but it's still important to point out that you're going to want to use chemical-free and rot-resistant lumber when building raised beds because that wood has contact with the soil and you don't want the chemicals to leach out into the soil where your food is growing. Redwood is another naturally rot-resistant wood, but it's harder to come by these days. However, sometimes a homeowner will be taking down a deck, and lots of times his older decks are made of cedar or sometimes redwood. I know ours was made of redwood, and that is great wood to repurpose into raised beds if you have the opportunity. For the new beds that we create, we landed on, because there's so many different shapes and sizes you can offer, we just landed on using a 2x8 dimensional lumber cedar. The 2x8 is a nice size to work with because you can use just one layer for it's actually like 7.5 inches tall, but that's enough for a short raised bed. And if you use 4, that's enough for a raised bed that will keep rabbits out, that magic number of 29 inches. So it's a good value for what you're getting as far as height wise, and it makes it pretty easy for us to just, always be using the same dimensions. And then furthermore, we do the 2-inch wide just for durability reasons. So all wood will do a little bit of warping as it's exposed to the weather and as it dries. And I wanted to make sure that the beds that we're building were not going to pull away as they do that little bit of warping. I didn't want cracking or the weight of the soil inside pushing on the walls of the beds to cause bowing. So I just wanted to make sure we're using sturdy lumber. So that's why we went with the 2-inch. In the corners, we use 4x4 inch post cedar. For these tall beds, we put in cross supports to help prevent that bowing as well. And some other, you can see the screws here, some other reinforcement as well to just help keep that bed in shape as it dries. You should also know, back to that warping issue, if you're going to be building anything else for the garden, like using posts or a gate or an arbor of any kind, I always like to go for the cedar as well, because although it's more expensive than treated lumber, that pressure treated lumber warps like crazy when it dries. And sometimes it works out fine, and sometimes you get a really wonky looking gate or something like that. We learned that the hard way, I'm embarrassed to admit, but soil. So this is a whole thing. especially as people become more aware of the importance of being sustainable and the desire for healthy food, and understanding that the quality of the soil is the first step in having healthy food and wanting organic food. People are asking for organic soil. So there's a few things to discuss when it comes to this. For one thing, you should know that soil is not organic, or I should say organic is not the right label to use for soil. Organic is the certification that's used for food and textiles. And when we're talking about things that are used to produce food or textiles, the certification comes from the Organic Materials Review Institute, or OMRI for short. And so if you see that OMRI certification on a bag of, say, soil or compost, that means that that material is approved for organic growing. So it's great that this is out on the market. The problem is that when you're working with a large amount of, you need a large amount of soil to fill those raised beds, buying bagged soil is really expensive, and a lot of plastic garbage, by the way, too. Unfortunately, though, I don't know if there's such a thing as a bulk supplier of this OMRI certified soil, meaning that it's been tested and cleared within the acceptable limits of any sort of toxins in the soil so that it could be used to grow organic food. So what are your options? One thing you can do is create your own blend. You could get black dirt from a supplier and then buy the bagged compost and make up your own blend. In that case, though, you're still going to be dealing with, where did the black dirt come from? Is that from a trusted source? You could go ahead and use a garden supplier's blend, which is oftentimes using peat, which is a natural resource and typically not, contaminated in any way. But unfortunately, peat is not a renewable resource and not a very sustainable choice for large projects. I don't sweat, using some peat moss on planting blueberries or other acid-loving plants, because it's a great go-to. But when we're using large amounts of peat for amending soil and large swaths of land, or even doing these garden beds, I have a little more of a conscience issue with that. Some suppliers who are making garden blends, instead of doing the typical blend, which it feels like 90% of them out there for their garden blend are doing black dirt, sand, and peat. Some of them, instead of the peat, are doing compost, which is really awesome, especially because they're oftentimes utilizing local, compost and making, reusing it and putting it in their blends. For that, though, you're going to want to ask a few questions just to make sure that they're doing their due diligence and creating really hot piles that will break down any contaminants that are in the compost, because there's no rules or questions asked when people bring in their compost from their yards. A conversation with one of my favorite suppliers here in the Twin Cities area, Kern Landscaping, was helpful for me, though, because he pointed out that, the amount of organic material that's coming in for their compost is not going to be like people who just sprayed their lawns and now they mowed and they're bringing in their grass clippings. It's more like leaves at the end of the year, which typically don't have any chemicals on them, or like large amounts of yard waste. So that's really helpful to know and just keep in mind. And some things that you can do is just make sure, like I did, call him and ask some questions, like ask about the compost, ask about like how or why do they trust their supplier of black dirt and sand, like where's it coming from, and just get a sense of how comfortable they feel. In the end, if this is something that your client feels concerned about, you can talk to them about the options and the pros and cons of using a peat blend garden soil, a compost blend garden soil, or making your own with a certified OMRI bag compost mixed into black dirt, where you feel like you have a little more control over it. In the end, though, kind of after worrying about all this and doing a bunch of research into it, I kind of just discovered it's probably all okay. And moving forward, though, just making sure that you're using those best practices in your garden and landscape so that you're not adding and introducing any more junk into the soil. Okay, and our last material that we're going to talk about that we use a lot of are wood chips or mulch. So here's some questions that I hear about these and some answers I have. First of all, do wood chips spread pests and disease? So the kind of the idea here is that if a tree that is diseased is taken down and chipped and then used in a landscape, is that going to spread into my existing trees, plants, shrubs? And then therefore, do I need to be looking for something special when I contact a supplier or buy bagged mulch and things like that? The answer to that is actually a comforting one. So research has shown that even diseased tree matter that is spread on a landscape does not tend to transmit the disease to the tree, other existing trees, as long as it's not worked deep into the soil, which you shouldn't be doing anyway. You shouldn't be using a bunch of wood chips to backfill, when you're planting. And also so that you keep it pulled away from the trunk of the tree, which you also should be doing anyway. So using them on the surface in a proper way, no problem. Also, side note, there are regulations in place for like invasive species like the emerald ash borer, so that if a diseased tree is taken down, that will be handled correctly. Are colored wood chips safe? So people who like that, the bright red or the dark chocolate brown colors in their yard, in their landscape. The problem isn't actually the dye used for these, but it's more so that the wood is of questionable origin that is typically used for those mulches. So it's a lot of recycled wood, which is great, but it's like, who knows what kind of recycled wood it is. It could have been, treated wood that has chemicals, and you don't want those breaking down in your landscape, especially for growing food. So the safe bet would be to stick with the natural mulches. And then finally, there are just so many choices. I mean, there's like the fine hardwood blend, and there's a coarse hardwood blend, and there's cedar, and there's cypress, and there's pine. There's all these different choices. Just general rule of thumb, just know that like cedar and cypress are going to last longer because they have those rot resistant properties. Also, the coarser the texture and larger the pieces, the longer it's going to last. So if you're putting in mulch and you want it to stay and not go away so fast, do the larger chunks, not the fine blend. If you're wanting it to break down quickly and work into the soil, then go ahead and do the fine blend of mulch. Pine bark is beautiful. It actually is great for those people who want to have the darker brown color because it actually keeps that dark brown color. The only catch with the pine bark is that it's not so great at sticking to a slope, or if there's like often a flow of water through an area, it'll just float away. So in those applications, you're going to want to go for a shredded, not so much chipped or nugget, but more of like a shredded mulch that will kind of stick together and hold its own on a slope. So a little fun thing about wood chips and getting them for free is that, well, it's possible. So this is something that I like to offer to my clients. I mean, I just always think of what I want, and I'm a frugal person, so I'm always trying to pass on these money saving, but also just like sustainable options for people that's just less wasteful. And so there's some great options for that with wood chips. One is a cool company that sprouted up in the last few years called Chip Drop. So you can go to getchipdrop.com. You can sign up to just have a random load of wood chips dropped at your house. The drawback, and they have some really funny videos about this, by the way, if you want to check it out, but you have no control over the quantity or really the timing of the wood chips. So they connect you with tree trimmers in your area. The tree trimmers see your address, and then when they have a load and they want to drop it, they just drop it. So if we need to coordinate this with an installation, then sometimes they say, hey, our installation is a month away. If you want to see if you can get a chip drop before then, let's do it. Let me know if they end up dropping. And if not, the week before, I'll go ahead and order what we need and have it delivered by a supplier. Also cool about Chip Drop is that you can say that you'll take logs too. So if you're doing a natural kind of play space, or if you want to use logs as edging or for raised beds, I mean, there's so much you can use it for, which might especially be applicable at this time when lumber supplies are so high. That's some cool stuff. And then you just kind of have to know that you're going to be working with raw materials and kind of work with what you have and see how it goes. The other option, and this is what you're seeing a picture of here with my then 2-year-old little guy, is something we love to do every spring is just hail a tree trimmer. The tree trimmers are out you know, usually it's easy to find them in the neighborhood. And whenever I see them, I just walk up and I'm like, hey, how you doing? And I just say, hey, how would you like to get rid of that load of wood chips on my driveway when you're done? If they don't drop it at your driveway, they have to haul it away to somewhere else. So they're usually very happy to just put it in your driveway. And in this case, you kind of, usually since I'm there with them, I'm able to have a better sense of how much they're gonna dump. Either I can see how much it is, maybe they don't have a full load yet, and so I know I'm getting half a load, which is nice. Or usually they're really nice about it and they're like, well, how much do you want? And they'll just give me half. So this is great because it's also free. The thing with free is just realize that there's going to be a little less quality control. It's not going to be uniform pieces, all the same size. There's going to be sticks mixed in there. Sometimes there's a little garbage or debris mixed in. And just keep in mind that, I mean, you can do this any time of year, but early spring is like a really great time to do it because, again, the tree trimmers are out and the leaves haven't, flushed yet. So you don't have very messy, full of leaf debris mulch. You get this nice clean stuff. So now on to our final topic, rabbit proofing. And like I said, these guys get special mention in this presentation today because I just see it like time and time again as a problem. So lots of times I come to a garden for a consult and people just say, I don't know what's happening. I think I have bugs or squirrels or something eating my garden, because they have a fence up and they're sure the rabbits can't get in there. And I always look around and inevitably I find that little like spot where they're sneaking through a crack, or even more so than that, just totally busting through the fence. So on the left here is this great green plastic garden fencing that is marketed as protecting against rabbits, and they totally will just chew a hole in it and let themselves in. I started with this in my garden when we first moved into our home a decade and a half ago. And I was very distressed to see all of my new seedlings getting chewed on and nipped off down to the ground. And not only did I find one hole, but I also found a back door. So if I was ever to chase the rabbits through, they just snuck out the back. So then I moved on and I was like, okay, I'm gonna get this stuff. It's called rabbit fencing or vermin wire. It's only 1 inch tall, but like 2 to 3 inches wide, about 3 inches wide probably. These little tiny rectangles, it's made of metal, so surely the rabbits can't get in here. Oh no, they can. They just pry those bars open and they just get in. So after that, I added another layer, a new layer to my garden of chicken wire. And my home garden was not up for like appearances awards, so I didn't mind using the chicken wire. But that is finally what kept the rabbits out. But let's talk a little more about what you can do for a client when doing fencing for a garden. So here are some points to keep in mind. Number 1, use welded wire. 1 inch, oh, I didn't write that down on the slide, so sorry, but 1 inch welded wire. I wouldn't do it any more than 1 inch because like you saw with those rectangles, they can squeeze through or pry open larger openings. Make that fence at least 2.5 feet tall, just like we talked about with the raised beds. If you're using raised beds to keep the rabbits out, I like that, almost 2.5 feet tall to keep them out. Same thing with the fence. They can crawl, they can jump. They're very, adaptable and they figure out how to get in. So 2.5 feet tall. Oh my gosh, I did say openings no more than 1 inch wide. See you guys? Okay, thanks for bearing with me. So openings no more than 1 inch wide. And then bearing or bending the fence outwards. So here's a video I'm going to be showing you what I mean by that. And you can see an example of it at work.
So for this garden behind me, we had the question of what to do for the fence. We did a curved design here as it is part of this edible landscape that has this nice curve to it. So we wanted a fence that would be able to move with that curve. And also the client was looking for something to not break the bank. So you can certainly get like a really nice fully framed fence done with cedar posts all the way throughout, and that's going to run you a couple $1,000s. But this was an option that was still very kind of like sleek and not an eyesore like maybe some chicken wire fences can be, but a lot less expensive. So we used T-bar stakes for the posts around here, and then we used a 1 inch black PVC coated welded wire fencing for the fence. And the question is, how are you going to keep rabbits out? And that's always something you need to think about. Here she doesn't have a lot of deer, so we're able to do a lower fence. If she had deer, we'd want to go 6 feet tall, but this was just rabbits. So they like to dig under fences, and what you need to do then is either bury that fence a good like 6 to 10 inches, or what we did is instead of digging that trench all the way around the garden and burying the fence with all that extra effort, we actually took this fence and bent the bottom 10 to 12 inches in kind of like an L shape and bent it out away from the garden, and then came back in and filled in with wood chips. And so you can see we have this border here outside the fence. That's both because there's part of the fence being bent out that we needed to cover up, but also this is a great mowing strip. I say never put the grass right up to the fence, because then you have grass growing up in your fence and it's sneaking into your garden. This way they can mow right up to the edge, and like I said, we have the fence. So if you come up closer, I'll show you what we did. So down here you can see I dug away. This is where we bent the fence out, and it goes out to about here. We just staked it down with some landscape staples and then covered it up with a few inches of wood chips. And that takes care of the rabbit problem.
So in addition to watching out for weak spots in the fence, we also have the gate to think of. So you may do a great job all the way around the perimeter, but if they can walk right through the front door, that's not going to really help you, is it? So here with the gate, we have some other things that we do to make sure they don't get through. Again, aiming for 1-inch gaps, no more than 2 inches in around the gate, like underneath in the threshold area below the base of the gate and on the sides. And the thicker the wood, the better, to prevent chewing. I love that little picture of Peter Rabbit sliding through the slats of that garden fence in Mr. McGregor's garden. And rabbits will also kind of chew on those thinner slats. So if you can do some heavy duty wood, and also make good use of the wire as well, either reinforcing the wood with the wire or relying solely on wire, kind of like the design that you see there in that video we're going to play, that would really be helpful. And then also I'm going to talk about in the video about how to bury a threshold to keep them from digging under at the gate. So let's check that out.
And down here is the trick that you need to think of when you're gonna, we bent the wire outward away from the garden to keep rabbits from digging under for the rest, but how do you do that here at the gate? And all we do is we take a 4x4 cedar and we run that between the 2 upright posts with some corner brackets, and leave about a 1-inch clearance for the gate to swing in over that, and that's enough to keep them out. And I've never had a problem with them digging under that 4x4. However, if you think that you have aggressive digging rabbits in your neighborhood, you could always do an additional 4x4 or brick or stone of some kind underneath that as well, to keep them from digging. And this just creates a nice threshold entrance to your garden. Like I said, it's in ground, so it's not really a tripping hazard, and it keeps those rabbits out.
All right, so I hope that some of those tips on the fence and the gate can really just help keep those rabbits at bay. In addition to, I keep saying it, but if you're doing raised beds, making them tall enough so the rabbits don't just hop right in. Oops. All right, so that is our presentation. Here's this last slide here. I have an outline of what we talked about, if you'd like to just get a visual on that. And otherwise, just thank you so much for sitting here and watching me, and for being a part of this summit, which is just a really cool experience. I'm really looking forward to hearing all the other speakers as well. And please, if you want to learn more about my company, you can look at the website there, rustichillsgardenco.com, or if you want to reach out to me personally, connect on Instagram. I'm happy to talk with anybody. I especially love talking to people who are just getting started and they're at where I was a few years ago, just wondering if they could pull it off or not. Like, I would love to just talk to you if you have any additional questions that we didn't cover here, and just encourage you to go for it. So thanks a lot, guys. Take care.